Today we are going to address kind of the beginnings of Western philosophy. Socrates, the pre-Socratics, what was the world like around the time of Socrates in Greece and the philosophical discussions there, and then kind of making this natural turn to Plato, who becomes the inheritor of Socrates, and really kind of those man who translates Socrates by writing down these works and recording it and interpreting how these words are to be understood for us. And this is the aim of what we will be doing today. Socrates was not the beginning of Greek thought or Greek philosophy. We actually have a number of 6th century Greeks who were primarily concerned with the nature of the universe and its basic structures. These are really kind of the leaders of pre-Socratic thought, as most philosophers will address it. Probably the first man who gets credited as being the founder of Greek or Western philosophy is Thales of Miletus, 625 to 547 BC. The first philosopher, in many ways. He really tried to understand the nature of the world around him. He wanted to sort out thought and see what the world was like. For him, most of this came from notions that emerged out of water, and he had a sort of pantheistic understanding of the universe, that everything was alive, that life permeates in everything, and that the cosmos itself is some sort of living dance that is all taking place. He was really trying to figure out how this all was, and is as such kind of the first philosopher, as many would want to talk about. There are others who would also possibly get this same sort of credit. Parmenides, 515 to 450 BC, he tried to address the nature of reality as such, and so he's really kind of the first to go into notions of metaphysics. He argued and tried to demonstrate how his claims were true. So this becomes also an interesting sort of twist within some other sort of notions of philosophy, where you're not just postulating, but we're trying to prove, right? We're trying to deduct whether or not an argument is sound or not, and how things can move out. Most other people just made claims and were not as bold as Parmenides was. He was really trying to say, this is the case, and let me show you how I'm there. Really, his school of thought is that philosophy was founded on notions of proofs. Good philosophy had good proofs. Bad philosophy was just people postulating one idea or another. He addressed the nature of existence and also what did not exist. So instead of talking about everything might being alive, he's trying to relate to what also isn't the case. Another person who's usually kind of seen as a leader of early pre-Socratic thought is Pythagoras of Samos, 581 to 507 BC. Usually, most of you know Pythagoras from his Pythagorean theorem, which you probably learned in math class, right? He's known for his math, calculating sums. Kind of the first to postulate notions of irrational numbers and trying to understand the nature of reality through mathematics. And these were very much intertwined for Pythagoras. And you'd probably spend a good amount of time with him in a Greek philosophy class, because his school is also very influential moving forward. He's kind of summed up with the idea that everything is defined by numbers. This is kind of his philosophical moniker there. He's also possibly has the right to be called the first philosopher, because he's the first one to use that word. He's the first person to call himself a philosopher. He was asked if he was a wise man, and he said, no, I'm only a lover of wisdom. And as we discussed before, right, that philosophy, I'm a lover of wisdom. He might not be wise himself, but he's in love with wisdom. And so this is kind of the nice sort of tie he's got within that. Heraclitus is another early pre-Socratic philosopher, 450 to 480 BC. He's kind of what a lot of people think about as a sort of philosopher. He loved obscure statements, many of which still baffle people today. He's trying to confuse and obfuscate people. He really loved notions of puzzles and paradoxes. He wanted to challenge people and largely himself as well. He taught that there was some sort of underlying order to the world. This becomes adopted as the notion of the logos. which becomes very influential for all Greek thought kind of after this as well, where we have this personified wisdom being the logos, which existed within some other traditions, thoughts as well before this, but he's the first one to kind of identify this like underlining order within this sort of philosophical thought. Although he did argue that it is essential to know the logos, but the logos can never be understood, right? Again, those puzzles and paradoxes kind of wrapped up within all of that. We have a number of those pre-Socratic leaders of philosophy. Then we also end up having many contemporaries of Socrates, the people who he's interacting with. Many of these, actually, we have names of works that are attributed to Plato in dialogue with these people, and sometimes not. Sometimes there are their own kind of leaders of thoughts as well, and they do stand on their own, and they do have their own followings and leading schools of philosophy. Probably one of the more famous of the Socratic contemporaries is Democritus, 460 to 370 BC. He was an atomist, and he argued that the world consisted in many different particles that could be not reduced any further. Right, and the term atom literally means you cannot cut. Tom, meaning no, not, negative, Tom, cut. Right, so this is kind of the root of where that comes from, of where we cannot parse out and divide the world any further. In many ways, Democritus was the high point of ancient Greek science. He argued against Parmenides, who argued that the world was unified, eternal, unchanging, and unknowable. Democritus said that the world is multiple, and made out of multiple tasteless, colorless atoms, and therefore we can know certain things out of these little colorless, tasteless atoms that make up the world. He also incorporated lots of different notions of a lot of other autonomous and how this is going to be forward. It's interesting to see these sorts of debates played out in modern scientific discussion, especially with what is knowable, what is not knowable, how do we define atoms, etc., and what makes things up, and all of those fun discussions are very much lived out here in ancient Greece as well. Another contemporary of Socrates is Gorgias, 483 to 376 BC. He was a rather interesting man, and we kind of know him in large ways through Plato's writings as well, and in debates that he has with Socrates. But he becomes kind of one of the leaders of a school of thought known as the Sophists. The Sophists means the practitioners of wisdom, and they use different techniques in argumentation to kind of belittle and parody other philosophers of the day. And so it's interesting when we're having these sorts of debates back and forth with Socrates and Gorgias and other sophists, and the school of thought that kind of grows up out of this, and you have this sort of tension of what can be known. Gorgias is the one who proved that nothing exists. His argument is that nothing exists, that if anything did exist, it would be unintelligible. And if something is unintelligible, then you can't say anything about it. Therefore, there's nothing that's there. Interesting sort of proof, right? And really this was kind of used not because he believed it, but it's a critique against Parmenides in this idea that philosophy is with proofs, right? He's almost pushing that there's more than just a good argument, that there has to be some sort of soundness behind that. Because otherwise arguments could be used for anything, and therefore are really indistinguishable from rhetoric, a school of thought which is already in existence, right? How are you going to sway people one way or the other? This is where we often will get our modern notion of just calling something sophistry. We'll be kind of out of this critique that it's almost just rhetoric. And the school of thought that kind of grows out there is how do you use the arguments to really undermine the notion of argument, and what is the strength in these claims, both of which are very important for discussions at the time of Socrates and moving forward. What's really important in this discussion of philosophy too is there's an argument about what makes up the world. What is the worldview we should hold? What is the correct understanding of the nature of the universe around us? And how should we move forward within these sorts of discussions? It's not surprising that this is a question that still holds modern philosophy, right? What shapes our world? How are we going to understand it? This is, in many ways, why it's hard for you to understand ancient or medieval or even early modern thought, is that the worldviews are different. Now, most of the pre-Socratic philosophers focused on understanding the nature of the world, and in part could be seen as natural scientists, as we might approach them today, as much as they were philosophers, right? They were trying to look and observe and record what the world had around them. We have many different ways of approaching what the universe is made up of and where we stand in it, right? There's arguments that the universe is singular. There's arguments that the universe is multiple, that there are many universes or many worlds. And again, we actually have some very similar thoughts in modern philosophy and modern astrophysics and, right, and different sorts of notions of sciences today. There were arguments as far as what made up the world as well. Is it made up of water, of air, of numbers, of atoms? What are atoms? What constitutes them, if we're going to be an atomist right there. Increasingly, though, there becomes this argument of infinite loops of recurrences. Formally, this is an argument known as the eternal return or eternal recurrence. Eternal return, right, is in many ways a hard argument for most of us to understand. But if I was to stop and ask you, how many times have you been here before? Wherever you are right now, how many times have you been there before? How many times have you been listening to this lecture before? Now, some of you might actually be doing this a second or third time and admitting that right now, going, okay, I need to go back and catch those notes, right? But how many times have you been here before? Most of you would say, right, once. This is it. This is my moment. And even if you are listening to the same lecture again, you're not saying it's the same thing. You're saying that you've just kind of have, this is a new experience of the same event, right? You're doing the same thing again. But there's also this argument that the universe is infinite and eternal and ever repeating, that we have been here an infinite number of times before, and that we will be here an infinite number of times afterwards. That there is this cycle that goes throughout all of infinity, over and over and over again, right? You have ever had that notion of deja vu, that you've been there before. For many, and we get this argued clearly by Zeno, who's an early philosopher as well, 336 to 265, that you have indeed been here an infinite number of times before. The reason why you recall an event is because you've done it before, and you will do it again. That great moment you wish you could relive, you will. So that's great. That horrible moment that you kind of, never wanted to do again and thought was embarrassing and don't even want to bring up, you're going to do that again too. Now, interestingly enough, there is some arguments within some philosophical schools that had this notion of eternal return, of possible changes, which is its own larger discussion. But Zeno is really the one who's accredited for this. Zeno of Cittium, he's the founder of Stoicism. Nietzsche actually argues for many of these notions as well from a modern perspective. And it's found in many different cultures all over the world. This is not just a Greek thought. You find this throughout literally the entire world. There's this notion of ever repeating, and sometimes you're a part of an ever repeating cycle that will come back around. Sometimes you're not, and it's just the cycle. But this idea of constantly redoing the same events is very much kind of identified in many ways as the worldview of the ancients, and then there becomes more advanced thought on this idea as well. We see large elements of this worldview for both Socrates and for Plato, especially in our readings of Meno. Main criticism of this worldview going forward was actually Christianity and ancient Judaism and a few other Mediterranean linear worldview religions, right? That talks about there being a beginning to the universe and a middle and an end. This is very much a kind of confrontation of Greek and other worldviews as out there. Socrates really is the the gold standard of ancient Greek philosophical thought, right? We divide notions of philosophy in Greece of pre-Socratic and post-Socratic, right? Socrates is this focal point, the one who challenges and changes many of the different understandings we have of ancient thought. He becomes his own sort of man, who also didn't write any of it down, right? We have other people who interpret it and move forward within that. 470 to 399 BC, he marks this shift from also a natural science or cosmology in philosophy to notions of ethics and politics, which will dominate many of the philosophical discussions later. Knowledge of reality becomes uncertain, but moral knowledge becomes possible. And again, we'll have this echoed even by modern philosophers. People like Kant make sorts of notions about arguments along these ways as well. He's the most famous philosopher who never wrote a single thing down. We largely know about his life from two different sources. Plato, Xenophon, and a few other fragments that wrote what becomes known as Socratic discourses. Right? These are works where the main character is Socrates, and the discussion were retellings of Socrates and his encounters, usually debates with others. Usually these debates are very dramatized, and Socrates kind of advances this philosophical discussion within them. The other source we have are people like Aristophanes, who wrote a comic caricature about him in the work known as The Clouds in 423 BC. What's interesting about Aristophanes is that he was not a follower, and really what he ends up presenting of Socrates is something that's meant to demean him and to reduce him. What we actually know about Socrates is kind of fragmentary from these different sources and in a kind of constructed in a different way. We do know that he was married, that he had children, that he served in the Athens army during the Peloponnesian War, and was engaged in politics of Athens and notions of the democracy for those who were free. Socrates was also called by others a wizard and a stingray. So we do know, obviously, that his tongue was important in his argument. At the age of 70, that he was convicted of charges of impiety and corrupting the young before being executed. Usually this is understood through drinking of poisonous hemlock tea. Why do we really like Socrates might be another question. If we know only other stuff and some people liked him and some people didn't, and he was convicted of corrupting the youth, etc. He's great because he also liked to be proved wrong. Right? This becomes an important aspect for Socrates. Right? Unlike Parmenides, who wanted to be right, or Gorgias and the Sophists, who wanted to play with good arguments, Socrates wanted to know what was right and what was wrong. This is very similar to that other quote you see from Marcus Aurelius, right, who says that it is a harm to persist in a wrong opinion. Right? Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics that will come out later will definitely borrow this same sort of idea from Socrates. To achieve this, Socrates was often engaged in a dialectic. A dialectic is a discourse between two or more people holding differing points of view about a subject, but wishing to establish the truth through reasoned argumentation. Right? So it's not just an argument for an argument's sake. It's a discussion. It's a debate between two or more different sources where I'm trying to draw out the truth from you and you from me. Right? We'll often even hear about people being Socratic with their nature of teaching courses, where it's engaging through asking questions and reflection. This becomes the sort of foundation of dialectic. In his dialectic, he thought up or invented possible cases as well, created counterexamples, and asked hard questions, possibly reducing the argument sometimes to nonsense, to show that it might not be worth engaging in, or that somebody else's position can kind of get reduced to an absurd and is therefore not a valid argument. Morals for Socrates were absolute. And he did like to confuse people, and we have this sort of notion in there in his writings and in the works of him. In the dialogues, we see that we have a sort of similar pattern that is constructed for Socrates. Socrates will raise a question about something important from an interlocutor. This is the technical term there. Several answers by the interlocutor are refuted by questionings. These questionings are known as elenchons. You don't need to worry about that. A crisis then develops, the aphoria. It arises where the interlocutor will recognize the insufficiency of their answers or attacks Socrates, right? Either they'll kind of go, whoa, I'm off, or how dare you, and start attacking him, right? Which is kind of what many of us do, unfortunately, right? When we're approached with something that challenges us, we'll either push back and aggressively against it, or we'll kind of ask a question, right, when we're unsure, right? The fight or flight sort of thing comes through. Next, then, Socrates becomes more directive, suggesting a different point of view to approach the problem. He's going to start saying, well, what about this? Could this possibly be the answer? And then, finally, the discussion goes to address the original difficulties of the questions. We go back to the beginning and say, all right, well, what did we learn here? What is maybe the best solution for this same problem that we were addressing? So this becomes the sort of pattern that we see over and over again in the dialogues. Plato really is Socrates' voice. Most of the time when we're thinking about what did Socrates say, we can almost say, what did Plato say? Because Plato is the one who's presenting Socrates. Plato, we're going to kind of give some credit for some of these arguments as well and these ideas, because he's using Socrates to bolster his own ideas within this sort of discussion. And so this is what we understand in the dialogues of Plato, who Socrates is. Two of which that we're going to discuss here is Meno and Phaedrus. The theme of Meno is whether or not the truth can be learned, and can virtues be learned, since virtue is a truth. Phaedrus, amongst other things, speaks about the nature of reality and what are the guiding principles and how we should see these. Now, Meno is a fantastic, easy read in many ways with this dialogue, and very typical of what we've seen in these styles that we were talking about. There's three people in the dialogue. All right, we have Meno, Socrates, and a slave of Meno, sometimes identified as a slave, sometimes just as a boy. His name and identity is only there to help advance the story. He's not the argumentor, as it were. And in here we're going to read things like Meno arguing, yes, Socrates, but what do you mean by saying that we do not learn? And what we call learning is only a process of recollection. Can you teach me how this is? Right? What do you mean that we're only recollecting, that we don't learn? Now, this is a very odd idea for most of us to start off with, that you can't learn anything. But you do recollect. And again, why does this work? Well, again, to go back to that notion of that eternal return. If we're going to have the idea that you've been here before, I'm not going to be able to teach you anything new. You've been here. You've gone through it. You either got it or you didn't. And therefore, I can't advance one thing or the other. You have to recollect what you've already learned and gone through. Socrates answers, I told you, Meno, just now that you are a rogue, and now you ask whether I can teach you, when I am saying that there's no teaching but only recollection, and thus you imagine that you will involve me in some sort of contradiction. All right, that we have this sort of interesting sort of twist coming out of that. Meno was really trying to kind of catch up Socrates, right? Can you teach me how I can't be taught? Right? No, again, I can't do this. You rogue, becomes a sort of discussion here. So then he brings in a discussion with a slave boy about what is a square. And he only asks the boy questions. He doesn't lead him. He doesn't give him the numbers. He doesn't give him anything, right? He just asks him. And then Socrates turns back to Meno and asks him, do you observe, Meno, that I am not teaching the boy anything, but only asking him questions? Now he fancies that he knows how long a line is necessary in order to produce a figure of 8 square feet, does he not? And Meno responds, yes. And does he really know? Meno says, certainly not, right? And Socrates says, if he only guesses that because the square is double of the line is double, and Meno agrees. And then Socrates says, do you see, Meno, what advances he has made in the power of his recollection, right? I didn't teach him anything. And you know that he doesn't know this because he's been in your household as a slave forever, and you haven't ever taught him. But yet he's able to reproduce this, so he must recollect something from a time before, or in his genes somewhere, right? If we were to kind of use modern examples, that there might be some sort of inherent knowledge. He did not know at first, and he does not know now, what is the side of the figure of 8 feet. But then he thought that he knew, and answered confidently, as if he knew, and he had no difficulty. Now he has a difficulty, and neither knows nor fancies that he knows. Socrates continues later. And at present these notions have just been stirred up in him, as in a dream. But if he were frequently asked the same questions in different forms, he would know as well as anyone at last. And Meno concedes this point. He says, without anyone teaching him, he will recover his knowledge for himself if he is only asked the questions. And Meno has to concede that this is indeed the case, yes. And Spontaneous says, and this spontaneous recovery of knowledge in him is recollection. Like, are we going to agree on our terms here? And Meno, once again, must concede. And this knowledge which he now has, must he not either have acquired or already possessed it? And again, he must have acquired this knowledge or already had it. You don't just have knowledge if it's not taught to you in any other way. But if he always possessed this knowledge, Socrates asks, he would always have known. Or if he has acquired the knowledge, he could not have acquired it in this life unless he has been taught geometry. For he may be made to do the same with all geometry and every other branch of knowledge. Now, has anyone ever taught him all of this, right? You must know this because he was born in your house. And Meno has to say, right, that he is certain that no one ever did teach it to him. And yet he has the knowledge. Meno says, yes, the fact, Socrates, is in fact undeniable. But if he did not acquire the knowledge in this life, then he must have had it and learned it at some other time. Certainly he must. Which must have been the time when he was not a man. Yes, right, maybe he knew this before he was born as a kind of pre-existence, possibly, or in a previous cycle, right? Socrates, and if there had always been true thoughts in him, both at the time when he was and was not a man, which only need to be awakened into knowledge by putting questions into him, his soul must have always possessed this knowledge, for he was always either was or was not a man, right? There's no point in which you are not and are the same thing, right? You either were or were not, and there's no other in between. So again, Socrates is saying that this knowledge must have been there at some other point, that you must have it somewhat innately and just needs to be drawn out in this sort of way. And if the truth of all things always existed in the soul, then the soul is immortal. Wherefore, be of good cheer and try to recollect what you do not know, or rather what you do not remember. Right? It's not a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of remembrance. And then he kind of closes by saying that you look upon this as a piece of chop logic, don't you see? As if a man cannot try to find either what he knows or what he does not know. Of course, he would never try to find what he knows because he knows it. I don't have to ask you what your name is and me prompt you and teach you how to do that because you know what your name is. I don't have to ask you all what 2 plus 2 is. You all know that the answer of 2 plus 2 is 4. I don't have to teach you that. I can't teach you that. You already know it. Because you know it, you'll not try to find and discover this. And in that case, there's no needs to try to find. Or what he does not know, Socrates continues, because he does not know it and knows what he will try to find, right? So you don't know what you don't know, and you can't know what you don't know because you don't know it, is roughly what the argument is here. You know what you know, so I can't teach you what you know. And I can't teach you what you don't know because you don't know it and you can't approach it, right? The knowledge is either in you or it's out of you. And so this kind of raises the sort of questions about knowledge and virtue as well. Are virtues something that can be learned or not? And this becomes a sort of debate amongst Socratics and Socratic contemporaries. You'll have people like Plato who will say that virtue is not something that can be learned. It is knowledge, and therefore it's something innate, that you either are virtuous or you are not. There are others who believe through encountering Socrates that they weren't virtuous and now are, and therefore must have learned it and learned it from Socrates. So we end up having these debates on whether or not all knowledge is something innate to the individual, either from this sort of eternal return or in an eternal soul that exists on one side or the other. Others might also apply to this idea of the knowledge exists elsewhere and it approaches you, but this is not exactly Socrates. And whether or not virtues can be the same, as virtues are indeed based upon knowledge and connected with this. In the work of Phaedrus, we have a further discussion about what is the nature of reality and how this works with your thoughts and recollections and knowledge. We hear very clearly, but people imagine that they know about the nature of things when they don't know about them, right? There's this very clear argument of like, you think you know stuff, but you really don't. Right? People often have an over-exaggerated view of your own understanding of the way that the universe is and how things work. You likely have a little bit of knowledge in some areas that you're like, yeah, I kind of know that, but again, you're not really an expert at it. And you have an over-exaggerated view of your own understanding. You've got a grasp on it, but you don't have that firm hold. And this is true for all of us. Have you ever spouted off something, right, in your own life that you just knew a little bit about and kind of were trying to present yourself as being a little bit more sure about it? And usually when there's an actual expert there, you end up getting humbled pretty quickly, right? They kind of look at you and go, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. You're off, right? And so your reaction and response to that becomes its own sort of larger debate. And so continuing here, not having come to an understanding at first because they think that they know, they end, as might be expected, in contradicting one another and themselves. This is the problem when we try to act like we know what we're talking about and don't. We end up kind of arguing against ourselves. We're not advancing ideas in the way that we really think we have. For Socrates, we see that the beginning of our discussion of what the passions do is rooted in ignorance. Here the notion of the passions are these impulses in you that oftentimes could lead to good or bad depending on who you are, and we'll probably touch on those ideas throughout the semester as well. Very similar to the ideas of ignorance causing problems we find within the Buddhist understanding as well. Right, that we have the cause of pain and suffering is in ignorance. And here Socrates is kind of saying the same thing, right? That we have our own ignorance will kind of puff us up, and then we'll end up kind of screwing up as a result of that, and then we'll have pain and suffering as a result of that. We see within this too that Socrates has two guiding and ruling principles. Let us note that in every one of us, he says, there are two guiding and ruling principles, which lead us whether they will. One is the natural desire of pleasure. Right? We all want pleasurable things. This is why we call it pleasurable, because we desire it in one way, right? He says the other is an acquired opinion, which aspires after the best. Right? So we want pleasure, and then we have opinions as what might give us pleasure. Right? So they're not always one and the same, right? Sometimes, by the way, this notion of pleasure might be translated as excellence. We have this sort of idea here. And these two are sometimes in harmony, and sometimes, then again, at war, he points out. Sometimes the one and sometimes the other concurs, right? Conquers. We have this sort of idea of we want pleasure. We're thinking, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go spend some time with these people because it's going to be a good time. And you go, and sometimes you're right, and sometimes you're wrong. You're like, wow, that person, I thought they were a great guy. They're a jerk. I hate them. Or hey, they're fantastic, lifelong friends. Everything's going well. Right? We have this sort of possibility, right? We want this pleasure, however we're going to see it, and sometimes we'll think that this is a good idea and it'll produce it. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes when we're seeking after something excellent, it is, and sometimes it's not. He says that when opinion, by the help of reason, leads us to the best, the conquering principle is called temperance. So if the opinion actually leads to the best, he's going to say that this is a temperate idea. But when desire, which is devoid of reason, rules in us and drags us to pleasure, the power of misrule is called excess. Right? So if we're only thinking what's best is because we desire something so strongly, and there's no reason behind that, it's just an animalistic impulse, right? This is now excessive, and this is going to sway us in the wrong direction. This is the sort of tension that Socrates kind of places within the nature of all of us, right? That we want excellence, and if we are using our reason to produce something, then this is the temperate, this is the good way of living, right? That we want a sort of temperate way of approaching stuff. If on the other hand, we're just going after our desires because we think this is going to be the best and it's kind of that gut control, that animalistic impulse, then that's excessive, and that's going to usually lead you not to what is the best, is what also Socrates is arguing there. Now, we get a sort of debate about the nature of virtue and our relation with it between Plato and Antisthenes. Antisthenes lived 445 to 365. He was also another follower of Socrates. He was a philosopher of his own right before he encountered Socrates. He's usually seen as the proto-founder of the Cynic school, and was a critic of Athenian society until he encountered Socrates. Once he encountered Socrates, he burned all of his writings, gave up his possessions, and followed Socrates, and tried to argue that he learned what virtue is from Socrates. Plato would say that you can't learn virtue, right? That it's knowledge, that it's ingrained, it's kind of who you are. But Antisthenes ends up arguing that there is something called arete, oftentimes translated as virtue, but arete really means personal excellence. And that this is something that we can learn and grow and develop. His argument is actually rather simple against Plato. I wasn't virtuous before I met Socrates. I had philosophy, I had studied, I had known. It wasn't a lack of understanding, but I didn't learn it. I had to learn personal virtue. And that after encountering Socrates, I learned this, right? So this becomes an important sort of distinction and argument over what can be learned and where virtue is to be found. Is it just a knowledge, or is virtue also something that can be developed and nurtured? Can somebody introduce you to an idea and all of a sudden that changes how you approach one thing or another, right? This personal excellence being important. Antisthenes, again, kind of is this early model of cynicism as well. The followers of Antisthenes as well, like later cynics, will abandon everything they own for Antisthenes and his direct followers. This was really to follow around Socrates and listen to him, having very few possessions, usually kind of depicted with just a cloak and a bag. In that they lived wherever they could find shelter. They were also usually without any jobs, and key to Antisthenes and later Cynics is this emphasis on self-denial and rejection of unnecessary material objects. That we need to abandon everything for virtue, for excellence. In this way, we have a very clear connection with later Cynicism. And the founding of the movement becomes a sort of debate on how you would want to do that. Usually most people are going to put this later on with people like Diogenes rather than Antisthenes, but that's the debate. Cynicism also later becomes known as a shortcut to virtue because you're abandoning everything for this virtue. You're giving up on your possessions. You're giving up on comfort to live this sort of personal excellence where you don't have all of the trappings of this material world there, that you're going to find peace without as opposed to peace with. And this becomes an interesting sort of debate on how we should look at that. This is definitely not how Plato constructed the world. This is contrary to Plato, but holding very similar sort of ideas, just a little bit more radical than we would have had as well. Now, Plato is more than just the mouthpiece for Socrates. Again, he becomes this sort of founder and shaper of that school. He lived in Athens. He was born 428. He'll die in 348 BC. His major works that you'll know, amongst other things, are the dialogues that he's reporting of Socrates, but also his Republic, where he's making arguments as far as the nature of what government and ourselves should be. And in here really kind of develops interesting notions about what is real versus where does the real come from. Oftentimes that other term for what is the form of the real might be known as the ideal or ideas or forms, right? So we have this sort of interesting sort of debate between the concrete and the ethereal, to put it in another sort of pairing. Plato really liked the realm of ideas and believed that truth is found there, in the realm of ideas, not necessarily just in the material. That we gain knowledge of this through what is real / actual or physical, depending on how you want to interpret all of that. That ideas become reality. So for example, and if I say the word tree, all of you immediately, when I say tree, have an image of a tree in your mind. There is a tree in ideas. And then again, this looks very different for some of you, right? Some of you, it looks exactly like that tree. But you also know that that tree that I just showed is just a cartoon of a tree. It's not a real tree. Some of you are looking outside your window and you see a tree right now. Some of you are thinking about a tree that you had a fort in that you used to climb, or something along those lines, or a fruit tree. Some of you are, oh, I go there and I get my apples or whatever. Some of you, your notion of a tree isn't even a tree. It's not even made out of wood. Some of you, I say tree and you're thinking of maybe an artificial Christmas tree, all decorated up, and you're like, oh, it's so pretty and it's beautiful. But it's made out of wire and plastic, and it's not made out of wood. It didn't grow. It wasn't living, but it has some notion of tree-ness. Similarly, I might even say you might think of just wood and think of a tree. Oh yeah, that 2x4 over there. That's what I think about with tree. Why? Because it has some characteristic of tree-ness, right? And so those two almost become very odd juxtapositions, right? One because it has the shape, and the other because it was once part of a living, growing tree and has the substance of the tree. But we have this idea of tree that exists beyond the reality of trees, of something you can touch. And you might argue it and debate as to what is a tree. Is it this thing or that thing? And so we have this sort of discussion between where ideas come from. And this becomes part of the most important thing for Platonic thought and debates between people like Plato and Aristotle. is the idea of where ideas come from. Right? Can ideas exist apart from particulars? Do you need a thing to have an idea about a thing? Or can that idea exist before that thing exists, or exist separate from that thing? Do all things which exist in the mind exist in reality in the material world? Or can things exist in the mind that have no connection to the material world? Do they exist somewhere else out there in the ether? And then where do they come from? Right? It's not just the mind, otherwise that we can't share ideas if it's just your mind, right? You and I have to have some sort of common connection on where we can go with all of that. Therefore, I can teach you something, or I can relate something to you, if nothing else, just to share this idea. Your idea and mine might be different because our minds are different. But we're able to still connect something, right? This becomes very important for Plato. For Plato, these ideas really kind of emerge through a relation between the realm of ideas and this material world through our soul. Sometimes translated or understood simply as our mind, right? Becomes this sort of connection. But the soul for him is pre-existent and immortal, right? And we had this sort of notion in our readings with Menno, right? That the soul always was, and therefore these ideas kind of entered in and related at this moment. The soul or mind links to the body through phenomena or becoming, this realm of ideas, this being, right? So we have these different stages there, right? So we have the soul as the intermediary between the realm of the ideas, being, and that of the body or becoming, reality, of the material world as we might see it. And this is how we end up learning things. This is how we have knowledge that comes to our body. Now, if it's like Socrates said, where it was pre-eternal or not, that becomes a sort of discussion within that. Now, the soul or the mind will establish this link through three different functions, usually identified as the appetite, the will, and reason. Right? The appetite becomes your impulses or sensuous desires that originate in your belly. Usually you can kind of see that connection pretty easily. Your will are your ambitions or spiritual energies, and this usually is seen as originating in your breast and your heart and your chest sort of thing. And reason, that of insight or understanding, which originates in your mind and usually corresponds as well for a yearning to the immortal world of ideas, which is its source. So your reason and mind kind of come out of here. So this is kind of the cosmology that Plato ends up creating and envisioning for us. Plato has a very interesting discussion on the idea of where ethics are and how you should see the ethical obligations you have to those around you. He ends up presenting this in a story called The Ring of Gyges. As you read The Ring of Gyges, it's an interesting story about a farmer who, after a great cataclysm, a giant earthquake opens up in the earth, and he kind of goes down there, and he finds a bunch of treasures, and amongst other things, he finds a ring. And he puts on the ring, and then he goes out and he's talking with his friends, and he's playing with the ring, and he notices that when the stone is facing out, his friends are talking to him. When it faces in, he's invisible, and he now has the power of invisibility. And so what does he do? Of course, he does what anyone else should do, according to Plato. He ends up somehow seducing the queen, killing the king, and ends up dominating himself and kind of makes himself the new leader of these people, being able to take whatever he wants, which many of us might find it a little bit odd of a stretch to do. But Plato says this would be the natural impulses of what you're going to have. He says that no man would keep his hands off of what was not his own when he could safely take what he liked out of the market, or go into the houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would. In all respects, he would be a god amongst men. For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice. And he who argues, as I have been supposing, will say that they are right. right? If he says, most of us don't like the notion of injustice, but we also believe that, right, if you're being unjust, then you're going to succeed, you're going to excel, and this becomes part of the challenging there. It says, if you could imagine anyone obtaining this power of becoming invisible and never doing any wrong or touching what was another's, he would be thought of by onlookers to be a most wretched idiot. Although they would praise him to one another's faces and keep up appearances with one another from fear that they might too suffer injustice. Right? So for Plato, right, the idea of if you don't do what you can get away with, being selfish, that everyone's going to look upon you as a wretched idiot. That this is kind of the nature of where we are. We'll end up getting to discussions of egoism out of this idea as well, of are we selfish or ought we be selfish? And is this a good thing or a bad thing or just how things are? We have this ethical dilemma wrapped up within Plato as well. And he's kind of positing this idea that this becomes part of the nature is that we want more, and that it's kind of through only sort of other rules and obligations that we kind of temper our desires and don't just take what we want, or it's out of fear of retribution. And maybe that's a positive thing. Maybe it's not. Maybe it will help society work or not. And we can kind of even see the trouble that invisibility has if we look at modern depictions of those who have the power of invisibility. Right? Any Invisible Man book, story, movie, they always start off good and end up being evil. You can almost ask yourself, would you rather have the power of flight or invisibility? And if you're thinking of visibility, it's because you want stuff. It's because you want to take things, right? It's not just because you want raw power to kind of live and fulfill. It's because you want to take or persuade what you shouldn't be getting. At least this becomes a sort of ethical dilemma wrapped up within a lot of people. So again, we have this sort of idea also introduced, which is an interesting sort of spin on the idea of being virtuous, that we're still doing all this for what is best for us. Thank you. So today we talked about ancient Greek philosophy and the kind of beginnings. We have kind of the early beginnings that what's usually identified as pre-Socratic with people like Thales, Miletus, and Pythagoras, as well as the sophists who kind of all begin with their discussions of what is the nature of the universe? How should we look at it? What is its shape and function? Beyond this, really, what's the value of an argument and where should that argument be? We really see Socrates kind of raising himself up, at least in the different discussions, as kind of being the master of these arguments. And also shifting from just what is the nature of the universe, but what is our response to that? And ideas of applying philosophy to the realms of ethics and virtues. And why would we have one understanding or the other? And again, linking this idea of what we know with how we ought to behave. And of course, this idea of personal excellence rising up as well. For Socrates, this personal excellence meant he loved to be challenged. He loved to be proved wrong, so that way he could change his mind. Now, usually the stories don't depict him being proved wrong all that often, but this becomes this sort of idea, and that even if he's going to die for this excellence, that is worthy to do. And then we have kind of the voice of Socrates and his own voice with the post-Socratic thinkers, with people like Plato, and later we'll talk about Aristotle, with people who will debate as far as what is the legacy of Socratic philosophy. Where do these ideas come from? Are they a part of this larger nature of the universe? How do they relate to us? Do we learn them from the particulars, or do they exist apart from them? And this will become part of the root of philosophical discussions going forward for millennia, and likely will still be the case for quite a long time going forward. So this became the sort of discussion that we had today. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Make sure that you engage one another in these discussion boards and let other people know where you kind of sit on this. What makes a good argument? Does it need to be true or just sound good? Do we have to have virtue that grows out of this, or is philosophy something that can just exist in the realm of ideas without also coming to the material? Right? These would be great discussion points to have. Thank you.